So, good morning everyone. I'm Ulf Sandberg and I'm responsible for services for MySQL. As you know, MySQL and HP has had a long and fruitful relationship. HP today is selling and servicing our customers through our enterprise offerings, and they're also a diamond sponsor at this conference, which we are very thankful for. Our next speaker here, next to me, is leading CTO at HP. Has a very long and distinguished background, including being the contributor for the Debian project back for 10, 12 years or something like that. He will talk about citizenship, open source, community rewards, and responsibilities. So ladies and gentlemen, next to me, please help me welcome Hideo Garbi.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working? Yeah, okay. I apologize to the AV folks who were a little freaked out this morning. My plane was incredibly late getting here last night, and I'm running on single-digit hours sleep, which those who know me will know is not a total unusual situation for me, but even for me, I'm a little bleary-eyed this morning. So, in any case, I'd like to thank our sponsors today from MySQL and the rest of their ecosystem, and the partner liaison folks at HP for arranging for me to be here. When I was invited, I was a little concerned that I'd feel like a fish out of water, but when I saw on the schedule that my good friend Evan Moglen was kicking things off this morning, I felt a little better. And then, of course, the problem is I came and listened to his talk, and as usual, I was left with that sort of general sense of inadequacy as a keynote speaker. It's such an intense pleasure for me, and I hope it was for you, to have a chance once again to listen to someone who thinks and speaks in complete thoughts. I will pay minor homage to him in a couple of minutes by quoting something that he said that he may or may not remember from a couple of years ago. To add just a tiny little bit to the introduction that Ulf so graciously gave me, I made my first contribution of source code to this thing we now call the free and open source software community back in about 1979. And there's actually some code that I wrote for a UUCP dialer that ended up in one of the late versions of the early Berkeley Unix distribution. I discovered Linux in 1994. The story behind that is fairly complicated, but it's been published a couple times yet, so go Google for it if you're interested. And I got involved in the Debian distribution fairly early and continue to be involved in that. I've had the pleasure simultaneously to have worked for the Hewlett-Packard Company in one capacity or another since 1986. Originally in the test and measurement part of the company, where I had the opportunity to help bring various open source components in that were included in products that we ship. And then since May of 2001, I've had the opportunity to work in the computer part of what's now Hewlett-Packard, on Linux and open source things full time, and since about May of 2003 have had this role as chief technologist for the open source and Linux business. And when I think about what that means and what it is that I'm trying to accomplish, there are a couple of things that I would open with as thoughts. One is this quote from a speech that Evan Moglen gave at Harvard Law School 3 years ago now, where he said that we now have a body of software accessible to everybody on Earth, so robust and so profound in its possibilities that we're a few man-months away from doing whatever it is that anybody wants to do with computers all the time. He was talking about free software, open source software, and I found that an incredibly inspirational thought, particularly when I combined it with this idea from another friend, Dan Shearer. There are so many clever things that could be done. And what I spend a lot of my time at HP doing is helping HP pick the right set of those clever things to do to maximize the return on the investments that we're making in our various contributions to this thing we call open source software on behalf of our customers. So my title today is about citizenship. And I think it's actually a fairly important topic right now. There are all sorts of interesting things going on. The behaviors that we see in the open source development community are changing and evolving over time. The expectations of our customers as they become more sophisticated users of open source are changing over time. And I think the way we all interact and play with each other in this ecosystem is an important thing to pause and spend a little bit of conscious thought on from time to time. I don't think it's possible to talk about citizenship without starting by talking about this concept of community and what it means in the context of the ecosystem around open source projects and how corporations like MySQL and HP participate in this larger ecosystem. You know, first of all, if you go and look at the dictionary, you get a definition of community that's something like this: a body of people having common rights, privileges, or interests, or living in the same place under the same laws and regulations. I think that sort of makes sense to us. We've all spent our lives participating in traditional real-world communities. They might be the towns that we live in, the places that we grew up, schools that we attended, the churches that we're part of, sports teams that we particularly care about, volunteer organizations that we contribute to. These are all different kinds of communities, and they're all things that we intrinsically understand. I think all of you that are here at this conference understand equally well that the internet enabled the formation of a new class of communities that really couldn't exist before the internet did. Though there are some interesting counterexamples that we could spend time on if I had more than 24 minutes and 34 seconds remaining. But this is a class of community where people with common interests and values, but who are potentially broadly geographically distributed, have the ability to come together in a virtual community kind of way to accomplish things that they could not do on their own, and where there wasn't a sufficient sort of geographic locality of people interested in the same things they were before the internet came along. And I've had the opportunity a couple times in the past to talk about why it is that the Linux operating system has succeeded where other free and pseudo-free operating systems failed previously, and it's very intertwined with the growth and the timing of the evolution of the internet and the willingness and ability of the early contributors to the Linux operating system to embrace that broad communications infrastructure and some of the functionality that it made available. When we bring this sort of into the context of open source, what we really end up talking about is this thing that I like to call the community development model. And what this, I think many of you understand that a key attribute of Linux and many open source applications is this notion that they're developed and supported by the community. And the key thing that leads to is this notion that there's no single company in charge. I think if you sat through the last panel discussion, you'd see that there's a certain hierarchy and order to things within any given piece of our larger open source ecosystem. And yet, everyone who is willing to bring an asset to the table gets to participate and gets to have an influence on what's happening. And no single company can choose to go out of business or change their business model or disappear, and in the process take something away from us that we already had. We can choose to give things up or stop using them, but those are choices that we have. It also leads to this interesting phenomenon that we have a range of contributors with varied interests and abilities, motivations, geographies, economic backgrounds, ideas about how social systems should work, who are all able to come together to contribute and work on together things that end up being much greater than any of us could have even conceived independently. And another thing that I talk about a lot when I'm talking about this concept of community citizenship and the community development model with HP's customers is that I think we need to realize that the licenses under which our software is created and distributed have this interesting characteristic in that they remove the traditional barrier between producers and consumers of software. Because any user that wants to can choose to become a developer, to pay someone else to develop or support the open source software that they're using on their behalf. In a non-open source software industry, it doesn't work that way. I think most of you in this room understand that, but as you go back and work on deploying applications in your companies, or as your companies go and engage with other customers, I think this element of freedom associated with the fact that any user can potentially be a developer is something that we shouldn't lose sight of, because while most users don't really want to be developers, the fact that they have a choice in where they go to get their support. They have the flexibility to decide who's going to provide support, and the knowledge that anyone they're willing to give a suitable amount of money to, because that person has the source code, can ultimately unwind, debug, figure out, enhance, change, modify, etc. the software they're using. This is a flexibility that you just don't get if you're not living and operating in an open source space. There are a few other thoughts I'll throw out about this notion of community before I switch over to talking about citizenship. I think it's really important to remind ourselves, and particularly when we're engaging with customers who don't quite get this whole open source thing yet, to remember that community, as we use it in the context of open source, really is plural. It's not singular. The open source community and the free software community, for example, have an awful lot of overlap, and it's very tempting a lot of the time to treat them as if they're one big homogeneous thing, but it doesn't work that way. Projects, as we think of them, software projects or small companies that form around these projects, are in effect communities of interest that have formed around software development, packaging, advocacy, whatever. And while any individual may choose to belong to many of these communities at the same time, in the same way that in the real world you might be a member of a church community and a follower of a particular college football team all at the same time, it's the complex set of interactions between these communities that makes this such an interesting phenomenon and leads to the powerful effects that cause open source, I believe, to have a fundamental evolutionary advantage over any alternative development and support methodology. I think also that it's interesting to note that in the larger ecosystem of development communities that we're seeing a couple of areas of growing interest in what I would describe as social issues. And to me, this sort of adds again this notion that what we're dealing with are communities. They are social systems. They're not just engineering activities. The first is this impact of paid developers on projects. I think it's interesting to look at some of the differences in the way financial influx in various projects have been handled. This is a place where I don't have some recipe for how to get it right all the time, but I think it's interesting to see that in the kernel.org community, most of the key developers now are fully funded in one way or another. They're either employed by a company like HP or IBM or any of a number of other companies, or they're working in an environment where the thing they do by day causes their employer to feel good about them spending the rest of their time working on the Linux kernel. But despite that influx of financial support for the key developers in that community, the flavor of how contributions are accepted, adopted, and integrated into that code base, and the role of reputation of the individual participants in that community really hasn't changed. I think that's a pretty neat thing. It's something that I would hope we can see percolate out into more of the key areas of development in this open source thing, particularly as we see the growth and adoption by customers moving into more business critical kinds of scenarios, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. On the other hand, we've seen some projects that have been incredibly strained by the influx of cash, particularly where it was a small group of purely volunteer contributors, and all of a sudden somebody's getting paid to work on this and somebody's not. Big discussions about who's getting paid and why, and is that changing the way they think about the decision-making processes they're engaged in. Again, I don't have any huge answers for this, but I think there's room for a lot more experiments like the things that people are doing by offering bounties to development communities, things that Google's done with their Summer of Code. I believe that we don't yet know all of the interesting ways that we as corporations and as for-profit companies taking advantage of and using open source software can influence, direct, and help to aid and abet the continuing development of this technological ecosystem that's become so incredibly important to us. I think it would also be remiss of me in talking about communities to not mention the increasing relevance that many communities are putting on gender as an open source development issue. I was privileged a couple of years ago to be invited to review the FlossPols research funded by the European Union as part of their fundamental research leading towards policy decision-making activities And frankly, I was stunned at some of the statistics that came out of that research. In the IT industry in general, we're in a situation where roughly 1 in 5 participants is female. At that time, there was a belief that in the free and open source software development community, it was more like 2%. There's something that seemed a little wrong about that to me. Maybe it seemed a lot wrong about that to me. And I've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this since I've had the opportunity to be invited to participate in some women in ... tracks at various conferences. The first couple times that happened, I thought it was sort of strange. I mean, after all, I'm sort of gender challenged for talking about this topic, it seems sometimes. But what I've come to realize is that many of the things that are wrong that have caused open source development communities to be unattractive, if not completely hostile to new female contributors, are things that actually negatively impact all of us. And it has to do with collaboration styles, communication styles, the modes of interaction within the community. And it's been my observation that when a project pays attention to this and tries to unravel and fix those sorts of issues, it has a positive impact on everybody in the project, and it has an energizing effect. The whole project becomes more productive. I'd love to spend more time talking about that, but I think the key here is that it's a topic we need to pay attention to, and I think there are lessons for both open source software projects, including many of the ones that swirl around this database ecosystem, and for our corporate human resources departments. So let's shift gears and talk about the citizenship thing. So I've talked about communities, I've talked about some of the issues that seem to be growing in awareness in communities. When I talk about citizenship, what is it that I'm really talking about? Let's start again with a dictionary definition or two. When I went and looked up citizenship, the words were not terribly satisfying to me. It said the status of a citizen with rights and duties and conduct as a citizen. So immediately, of course, I had to go see what the definition of citizen was. And I found a native or naturalized member of a state or other political community, one who is qualified to vote and has the right to hold offices. And if you think about that, that's kind of interesting. The first piece of that definition has to do with the communities that you choose to be part of or happen to be part of in the real world because of birth or something like this. And the second part is the participatory aspect to citizenship. It's the fact that you have a right to participate in the processes that make that community go. So when I think about what I mean when I use the word citizenship in talking about the open source community and its related processes, what I'm really talking about is active participation in one or more communities. Being a contributor, not just being a consumer. I think this is something that's fairly easy to understand as an individual. It's the idea of connecting this with the behaviors of a corporation as large as the one that I've been employed by for the last 20 plus years, where this gets sort of interesting. I think another aspect of what I mean when I talk about citizenship is working towards common goals in a group setting. I think this is another place where I can point to some interesting things that I observed in the panel that we saw just previously, where even when these different companies and different developers who've all worked on various storage engines are clearly out there competing for the hearts and minds of potential cash producing customers, they are all working towards a set of broadly articulated and broadly understood common goals as part of a larger community or group. I think that in the things that I've tried to influence in the way Hewlett-Packard participates in the various open source development communities that we contribute to, I've tried to make sure that there's an emphasis on this notion of doing it in accordance with the community's existing values and expected behaviors. We've had some interesting examples in the last couple of weeks of what happens in real-world communities when people seriously break societal norms and expected behaviors. And it's not a very comfortable or pleasant thing to be watching on the news. I would posit to you that it's just as uncomfortable for the participants and just as unpleasant in the potential results when we behave outside of the expected norms or behaviors of the open source communities that we're participating in as it is when we do that in the real world. I think it's okay to contribute to evolution. What I mean by that is it's a perfectly reasonable thing, and in fact probably strongly expected of us, that when we join a development community and we participate, that in the process of making our needs and desires known, of contributing fixes and enhancements to the code, of doing all those sorts of things, that we are helping to change the community that we're part of. And when I use the word evolution, I would hope that it's changing for the better, but I guess only time will tell. But I think it's important that as we participate in these communities, that we don't break too far away from those communities' expected behaviors. And in particular, because the principal motivation for a company like HP to participate in open source activities is to figure out how to focus our limited development resources, dollars and people, on the things that will help us differentiate ourselves from our competitors. It's really important that we figure out how to engage in that process of differentiation without breaching the trust of the communities that we're participating in that process. So to talk a little bit more about this concept of participation, I think we have to realize when we're talking about this concept of citizenship in a community that open source communities are almost never democracies. Many fall much closer to this notion of a benevolent oligarchy or a dictatorship where just because you show up and just because you want to contribute some code, you don't necessarily get to have a full vote in the direct sort of democratic sense of citizenship. But if you constructively engage in that community, it will help ensure that your needs get consideration. And I think there's an interesting process that happens when people choose to join these communities, either through the process of using a piece of software that was developed in this community context, or by, if they're a developer starting a new project, by choosing which license they're going to adopt for that software. There's a process very akin to naturalization going on here. I've had some interesting conversations over dinner with people over the years about this sort of dichotomy that you see in real world communities between people who are born in a place and therefore have the freedom to take for granted many of the rights and freedoms that are offered to them by being part of that community, and what happens when somebody consciously chooses to join a community and has to go through the hazing process, if you will, the rituals of acceptance of the societal norms. The Debian community that I've been part of for a long time has gotten fairly sophisticated about this. The new maintainer process is a topic of frequent discussion because it's not easy and it takes a long time. And some people that you think of as open source luminaries have given up in the middle of the process because that community has decided that ensuring that the people who joined that community really do understand, accept, and are willing to abide by the societal norms of that community is an important thing for them to be successful. But you know, to sort of bring this back to earth a little bit, I'm not trying to be sort of too esoteric about this. There are a couple of quotes that I think, when brought together, sort of coalesce the ideas that I have when I think about what this participation thing is supposed to all be about. The first one is this quote, very famous quote from John F. Kennedy's 1961 inaugural address about, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. But interestingly enough, there's another flavor of that in the following paragraph that I think is actually even more apropos here. Ask not what America in that case, but insert whatever your favorite community name is, can do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. And if you connect this back to this notion that I talked about under the concept of community, of the freedoms that we get, the choices that we are enabled to have as part of participating in this open source ecosystem, I think this is something that we can all take to heart. We get something, we get rewards, we get benefits from using this software, even if our participation is as simple as reporting the bugs that we find and providing, a good explanation of what caused us to get there and why we think it should work differently. This notion of taking a participatory role is a fundamental distinguishing feature between someone who, in effect, is just using the results of our efforts, which may be okay, and someone who is choosing to actively engage, participate, and by doing so, help us to be motivated to do more stuff for the future. I also would be remiss if I didn't throw in particularly in the context of Evan's talk earlier this morning, one of my other favorite quotes about citizenship and community participation, which is this notion that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We have to think, we have to pay attention, we have to understand, and we will be more effective if we spend the time doing that. So what does all this mean in the concept of HP? What is it that I spend a big chunk of my time doing? I've already talked about this notion that I think it's important for us as a corporation to figure out how to participate directly as an open source community member. HP doesn't work with the community. HP is part of the communities that we choose to engage with. That may seem really subtle, and yet it's very interesting inside a corporate ecosystem when you start to push on that particular distinction and you talk to people and you're mentoring people about how and why and when they should engage with the open source community to make things happen that they'd like to see happen that aren't necessarily already being worked on. In the process, we work pretty hard to support existing community values and behaviors and focus on those things that help us develop robust enterprise capabilities that are of interest to our customers. Because, again, it's not a hobby. I mean, for me, open source free software has been something that I didn't always get paid for, but I do now, and in working in the corporate environment, it's very important to understand that this only makes sense when there's some kind of a return for the investment that's being made. One of the key things I point to around this notion of using existing community values and behaviors is that HP uses existing open source licenses. We've made a significant number of contributions to the open source code bases of the world, and we've done so entirely without the need to create a new license. We've been very pleased with the GPL version 2 and other licenses that have existed in our community, and if you go take a look at opensource.hp.com, you'll see relatively long lists of projects that we have initiated and projects that we've chosen to contribute to under these existing licenses. It's also led us to be a very active participant in the GPL v3 process. That has been an intriguing process, and I'm not sure exactly where things will finally land. I'm pleased that Evan is now having the opportunity to start thinking beyond that process a little bit, because I'm sure it has been, given how consuming it has been for some of us in the little team in HP that are trying to help contribute to this process, as just one of the many participants. I can't imagine what it's been like for the folks trying to wrangle that process. And then, of course, we work with Linux distributions and ISV communities like this very rich ecosystem that has formed around the MySQL database to deliver innovative and effective solutions for our customers. So why is it that you should care what I think about this or about any of the stuff that I've been talking about? Well, I'll give you two answers to that. The first one is, pardon me for a second, it's a little marketing-ish, but I got to throw it in anyway because I had the opportunity to hear my company's CEO in person speaking a couple of nights ago at another event that I was attending. And he threw out a statistic that really startled even me working inside the company. I think it's no secret to anybody that we've been the leading seller of servers that end up running Linux for something like 9 years now, if you combine the pre-merger HP and Compaq numbers. But knowing that on some intellectual level somehow doesn't convey, I think, the significance that popped into my head 2 nights ago when our CEO pointed out that we sell and ship a new server every 11 seconds. And if you believe our estimates, and that's the best they can possibly ever be, is estimates of how many of those end up running Linux, and we do correlate this with analyst data and so forth, that means that we are selling and shipping a new Linux server at least once a minute. That's a pretty big number. And even when you realize that for the companies that are represented at this conference as part of this open source ecosystem, it's not just Linux that's the target. I think that's not a bad way to get a sense of, to first order, of the scale of the potential addressable market that we're talking about and playing in here. But I think there's another answer that's worth thinking about, and it's a little broader and it's totally unrelated to trying to be, corporately focused on my company at least. And that is that There's this increase in sophistication going on just broadly in the open source market. Complexity keeps increasing. The software itself, the things that we are developing and deploying are so much more complicated than the things that came before. You know, I remember, as somebody who's been involved in compiling and building and writing software for Unix-like systems for a long time, with great pleasure the days when the toughest decision you had to make was that you pick the BSD or the System 5 version of the makefile. Well, you know, those days are gone. We're not talking about simple command line executables. We're talking about deeply layered software ecosystems, many more abstractions, APIs, and other interfaces. And frankly, we have built for ourselves an interestingly complex license interaction problem to deal with. I've been very pleased over the last few weeks as I was invited to join the Open Source Initiatives Board as a non-voting observer of their board, to have a little closer ability to inspect some of the activities they're engaged in around trying to address license proliferation as a problem. This is something that my company and my former immediate manager, Martin Fink, who's now moved up to bigger and better things within HP, have talked about a lot, but I think it continues to be something that we need to pay attention to and worry about, because it's an element of complexity that's not necessarily doing us much good. I'll be really intrigued to see, as the GPL v3 process winds down, whether in the end it has a positive or a negative influence on this complexity of license landscape that we all get to interact with. But I think also as customers expand their use of open source to more critical applications, the profile of the deployments that they're engaging in is going up. And this invokes a whole set of broader business concerns that many of us who are deep technologists working in this community may not have had to deal with before. They really care about mission-critical support offerings. This is one of the things that I think is so cool about the relationship that we as a company have forged with MySQL and several of the other members of the larger ecosystem around this database technology, because we have the ability as a global company to scale that sort of initial support offering and to be able to resource and provide mission-critical support offerings in the various places in the world where customers have gotten to the point of trying to deploy this technology in ways that makes that particularly relevant. And this whole topic of indemnification comes up particularly when we're talking to customers in places like the financial services industry where, you know, it's not because it's shiny and it's not because it's free that they're excited. It's because there is a potential for them to realize a net financial benefit at the end of a large-scale open source deployment. And when there are risks to them that aren't immediately handleable with a simple financial transaction up front, that reduces their enthusiasm for using the stuff that we care about. And so this is a topic I expect to continue to hear about and for us to have to wrangle with in the future. And it is just the way of things that as our customers become more sophisticated, the nature of the questions they're asking is changing. And if we work together as citizens of these communities and the ecosystems that exist around the projects that we care about, I think we can work together to help answer those. And part of making that happen is this realization that I think I've had and we've had at HP, that for a corporation to be a good citizen of the kinds of communities that we're all deeply concerned about, particularly for a company or corporation that engages in software development and may have a patent portfolio around their historical, efforts to develop software, that active governance processes really seem to be a necessary part of this equation. And what I mean by that is it's important for companies, not just those of us who are producing products that go into this ecosystem, but also for our customers who themselves often are engaged in software development activities, to ensure that their interactions between open source and the things that they've developed, that they have patents or other intellectual property protections on, that those interactions occur consciously so that nobody's surprised, so that nobody's disappointed, and so that this participation in this community process is one that becomes perceived as having been a positive and good thing. And I think that, we also expect that companies that choose to participate in our open source activities are going to honor the terms of the licenses that we've chosen. and all of those related things that swirl around that. I think it's also been our experience in HP in working with customers that when we focus on these sorts of governance activities, that they often expose areas for improvement in their overall IT governance processes. It's not that dealing with open source is really all that different. It's just that in the past you may have been able to trust that your lawyer put the right language in the contract that you signed with somebody, and now it's their fault, not yours, if something goes wrong. And you don't always have that same kind of interaction occurring if you choose to directly interact with open source projects. And so this is why sometimes choosing to become more actively involved in open source processes is actually leading a number of our customers to become more sophisticated and more successful in dealing with their IT issues in general. And of course, because we have participated ourselves as a company for so long in so many different open source projects and have had to build internal processes and tools behind those processes to do these governance things right, this is something we would be happy to work with all of you and with our other open source using customers to try and help make sure we all do right for the future. So to wrap things up, I think the importance of this whole open source phenomenon really can't be understated. There are evolutionary advantages associated with everyone who's involved in the software, from the person who originally conceived of the idea to everyone who chooses to make even a casual use of it. And I will admit, I'm a casual MySQL user. I've had a Myth TV box in my living room for a number of years, and I absolutely depend on that thing working right when I'm on the far side of the world and my wife and kids want to watch TV. So I'm very pleased to be a casual user and to participate in this ecosystem, at least in that teeny tiny little way. But if we all choose to be active participants in these communities, we will help ensure a future that is exciting, where we still get to do shiny things, and more people make more and more important uses of the stuff that we've done. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Appreciate it very much.